Welcome back to Buddhist Audio Bookshelf. Today, we continue our journey through Dharma Talks by Thanissaro Bhikkhu, Geoffrey DeGraff. Join us in exploring these insightful teachings. Meticulously curated by our team, this audiobook is a conduit for Buddha's wisdom. Your support in sharing these teachings is pivotal. Subscribe, like, and share to expand their impact. Let's collectively enrich the world with Buddha's profound guidance. Relax and absorb these teachings' essence as we progress on this enlightening path. Let's start our reading with The Wounded Warrior. August 14, 2008. The practice of the Dharma is often compared to being a warrior doing battle with your defilements. And it's important to have a realistic view of what it means to be a warrior. The romantic view sees the warrior as someone who is always strong, always ready to take on the enemy no matter what, no matter where, no matter when. But that's not a very realistic view of how warriors operate. Warriors have to choose their battles. And they also have to know their own strength. If they're wounded, they have to know that they've got to escape someplace where they can rest, recuperate, deal with their wounds. In other words, instead of always taking on the enemy, there are times when you have to run away from the enemy, find a place where you can gather your strength. An intelligent warrior admits his or her weaknesses. When you find that you're weak, you do what you can to make up for it. At the same time, you don't take on more than you can handle. Ajahn Lee talks about going to the forest for lessons. When people got to be too much for him, he'd go out into the forest to hide out for a while, to rest, recuperate, deal with his wounds. And so even someone like him with that much strength of concentration, strength of mindfulness had to run away sometimes. We're not even anywhere near where he was, so we have to find places of rest, two places of solace where we can work on building our strengths. One of the lessons he learned one day in the forest came when he and some monks and novices were going on alms round, and they saw a wild hen. The hen saw them coming, made a squawk, and all her little chicks went running into a pile of leaves. So Ajahn Lee had some of the novices go out and stir the pile of leaves around with a stick to see what would happen, if chicks would run out. But they didn't. They all lay there very still. That was their protection. So learn a lesson from the chicks. Sometimes when issues in life get very difficult, we've got to find some stillness. As you're sitting here meditating, part of you may say, there are these issues I've got to deal with. So ask yourself, are you up to it? If you are, go ahead. If not, just stay there in the concentration. Concentration is a form of strength. It's one of 5 ways the Buddha lists for strengthening the mind. The first strength is to have conviction, first, in the awakening of the Buddha, that it really did happen, he really did awaken through his own efforts. The message there being that he was a human being. He could do it. And even though he was a special human being, he said that he wasn't using any qualities that other human beings didn't also have the potential for. So we have the potential for awakening within us as well. We've got to hold on to that conviction, whether it seems especially realistic right now in terms of the state of your mind right now. You can take comfort in the fact that you too have those potentials, that you too can develop them through your actions. Which is the second part of conviction. That your actions really do make a difference. They are real. And the quality of your intention is what determines the results of the action that you're going to experience in terms of pleasure or pain. The solution to whatever problem there is in life starts primarily with looking at your own mind, admitting the fact you may have acted in unskillful ways in the past, but you can also train the mind to be more skillful now and on into the future. If you find that you're not ready for the other ways of strengthening the mind, you may want to sit around and just think about that for a while, gain a sense of confidence that this is true. And that will energize you. The second way of strengthening the mind is to develop persistence, the ability to stick with something. It doesn't mean just gritting your teeth and enduring. It means learning, once you've determined what the skillful course is, how you can keep yourself on that course. You learn how to make it more attractive, more pleasant, so it's not just a matter of barreling through, because that kind of energy, that kind of barreling through persistence wears out pretty quickly. The Buddha made the analogy of playing a lute. You tune the main string on your lute so that it's not too tight, not too loose. And then you tune the other strings to that first one. In other words, the level of energy you have is the main determinant of what's too tight or too loose at any one time. So you figure out how much strength you have, and then how you can maintain that level of strength. This is one of the reasons why in the breath meditation we're taught to find as much ease and fullness and energy as we can in the breath, because it's one of our allies for strengthening the mind. When the breath energy feels good in the body gets stronger, and the mind, dwelling in a comfortable place, finds it easier to stick with the skillful path. And then there's mindfulness. What things can you keep in mind right now that are healing to the mind? Sometimes simply reflecting on the body. If you start thinking about your emotions about this person or this issue or that issue, it gets you all riled up. Just say, I'm sitting here with a body. Breathing, that's all I have to think about. That's the range of my awareness right now. Being with a body in and of itself and trying to make the sensation of being with a body as pleasant as possible. Just keep that in mind. This is what mindfulness means. Keeping something in mind. You keep the body in mind. You put aside greed and distress with reference to the world. Any world issues, you just put them aside right now. You don't have to go there. If you go there, Mara will get you. The Buddha talks about this being your ancestral ground, your safe place, your haven. Right here, the breath in and of itself. If you go out thinking about this issue or that issue outside, you're leaving your safe place. The Buddha makes two comparisons here. One is of the quail who wanders away from his safe place, a field where clods of dirt and rocks are all turned up by the plow, where he has hiding places. He leaves that and goes out to a more exposed place, where a hawk gets him. And as the hawk is carrying him away, the little quail says, "Gosh, this is my own lack of merit. I shouldn't have wandered away from my safe area. If I had stayed there, you wouldn't have been any match for me." The hawk, being piqued a bit, says, "Well, what is your safe area?" The quail says, "It's a field where the stones and clods of earth have been turned up by the plow." So the hawk says, "Okay, I'll let you go. You can go there if you want, but you still won't be able to escape me." And so the quail flies down and gets on top of a rock, taunting, "Okay, now, come get me, you hawk. Come get me, you hawk." And the hawk, without saying anything, folds his wings and dives down after the quail. As soon as the quail sees that the hawk is coming after him in full tilt, he slips behind the rock. The hawk crashes against the rock, and that's the end of him. In other words, see the body in and of itself as your safe place, where you can escape any issues that otherwise would overwhelm you. Just be very firm. I'm going to stay right here. I'll try to get as much ease and comfort out of the breath as I can so I can maintain this state. For the time being, I'm not going to go anywhere else. When you do this, you put the mind into concentration. After all, what they call the foundations of mindfulness, the establishings of mindfulness, or the four frames of reference. These are the themes of right concentration. If you stay here consistently enough, it turns into concentration in the mind. Then you can feed off the sense of ease and rapture that comes with the concentration. That's your food for the mind. And the body gets nourished as well, because you let that sense of ease and rapture spread throughout the body. This provides a basis for discernment to arise. The ability to look at those thoughts that were wounding and hurtful, the issues in the outside world that have you all upset, and to see them simply as thoughts arising and passing away. You have the choice. Do you want to go into that world or not? If you feel obliged to go into that world, ask yourself why. Am I ready for that world right now? Can I handle it? If you're not ready, try dismantling whatever values would lead you there. You're not obliged to think about these things. And if you're not ready to think about them, why burden the mind? Start questioning all the assumptions that would pull you out there, whether they're pride or whatever. Again, remember you're a warrior. A warrior can't let his or her pride get in the way of the healing process. You may want to look strong, to be strong, But hey, you're not strong right now. You're wounded. You've got to deal with your wounds first. That's the attitude of an intelligent warrior, a warrior who will come out winning in the end, the warrior who knows that you've got to look after yourself. I've told the story before of the Chinese martial arts master whose students were going to have a demonstration of their martial arts skills in a pavilion out in the forest. At one spot along the road through the forest to the pavilion was a donkey well known for being very obstreperous, always in a bad mood, always ready to kick anybody who came anywhere near. And so some of the students who were on the way to the pavilion said, "Hey, here's a great chance for us to show off our skills at martial arts. We can deal with this donkey." And so the star martial arts student goes up first and takes one of his stances, and the donkey just kicks him across the road. The number 2 student comes up, says, "That's not how you it." He tries a different stance, but he gets kicked across the road too. And to make a long story short, everybody gets kicked across the road. So they decide, wait, let's see how our master will handle this. Maybe he's got a skill he hasn't taught us yet. So they hide behind bushes on the side of the road to watch. Finally the master comes along, he sees the donkey, and he just walks way around it. Doesn't get anywhere near. This is part of being an intelligent warrior. You know to choose your battles, which dangers to expose yourself to, which dangers to avoid. The first lesson in Thai boxing is learning how to retreat, how to get out of a difficult situation without exposing yourself to danger. So as a good warrior, you have to know your strength. When you're ready to take on the battle, take it on. If you're wounded or weak, hide out someplace and figure out how to heal your wounds. And build up your strength. That's the kind of warrior who comes out winning in the end. The Ennobling Path. August 17, 2008. The path we follow is called a noble path, both because the activities of the path are noble activities, and because it turns the people who follow the path into noble people. In other words, it's ennobling. It fosters noble qualities in the mind. Qualities that make us mature, that make us adult. Qualities that in Ajahn Lee's image place us on a throne, so we're not slaves to craving out there, bending under the whip of wherever our desires may send us. It's a path that puts us in a position where we're above the desires, above our cravings. We can direct them, seeing which desires are skillful, which desires are unskillful. And learn the persistence and wisdom that enable us to follow the skillful desires, and put the unskillful ones aside, seeing what truly is in our own best interest. In other words, we sort through the imperatives our appetites place on us, and the imperatives that society places on us, learning to figure out which ones really are skillful. We need to sort out both areas because we come here with a head full of all kinds of notions from what our parents have told us, our teachers have told us, and the mass media have told us, and our basic desires, our hungers, our appetites. That combination can be particularly dangerous because there are parts of society that would want us to follow our appetites. What was that old commercial? Obey your thirst so that you buy our Sprite or whatever. We have to put ourselves in a position where we can sort through those things. What lessons have we learned from society are good lessons? What impulses do we have that are good impulses? How do you foster those, and how do you learn how to say no to the bad lessons and the bad impulses, the ones that are unskillful? It's interesting that the Buddha's take on maturity is very similar to what psychotherapy has to say about maturity. The good functioning of the wise ego. Its teaching parallels a lot of the Buddha's teachings. We're often told that ego is a bad thing. Ego, in the sense of egotism or selfishness, is a bad thing. But the ego in the sense of learning how to function in a way that figures out what is really in your true best interest, and learning how to filter out your impulses and the voices of society. That's a very necessary function. It has to be developed if you're going to be able to stay on the path. Psychotherapy talks about 5 healthy ego functions. Tonight I'd like to talk about 3. All 5 of them have parallels in the Buddha's teachings, but these 3 in particular work together in ennobling the mind. The first one is anticipation. You're able to look ahead into the future and see the results of your actions. This is a sign of a healthy ego, so that you don't simply give in to your spur-of-the-moment impulses. The desire for the quick fix, the inability to delay gratification. Someone was telling me that psychotherapists have discovered that children who are trained to delay gratification do well in life. Well, that's one of those obvious things we don't need psychotherapists to tell us. You see it all around you. Kids who are encouraged to give in to their impulses are the ones who have real trouble in life. The ones who learn how to tell themselves, no, this is not good right now, I've got to put aside my desire for the immediate pleasure for a longer-term pleasure down the road. Those are the ones who function well in life. And it's an important part of the practice. You have to see the danger that comes from giving in to your desires. In Buddhist terms, that's heedfulness. As the Buddha said, heedfulness lies at the basis of all skillful qualities. It was so important that it was his final lesson before he passed away. You realized that there are dangers waiting out there. If you act in certain ways, they are going to have bad consequences, both for yourself and for the people around you. So you want to develop that ability to look at your actions and see where they lead to down the line. Think, for instance, of the consequences of breaking the precepts. It's so easy to break a precept, especially when you feel that you're put at a disadvantage by the precept. We saw all that insanity after 9/11s, where people were willing to throw morality out the window because they were so scared. There was even that Buddhist teacher who said, this principle that hatred is never appeased by hatred, that it's only appeased by non-hatred, i.e. goodwill, was totally useless. Didn't have any practical application when things were so uncertain. Actually, though, that principle was designed for times when people really are seething with hatred, when they have to be reminded that you can't put aside your principles in a situation like that. When life is in danger, your first impulse may be not your best impulse at all. You need clear-cut precepts to keep reminding you that under no circumstances would you kill, steal, have illicit sex, lie, or take intoxicants. That's why the precepts are so simple, to be easy to remember in difficult situations. And they are meant to remind you to be heedful. Think about the consequences of your actions and learn how to foresee danger. That ability is what makes you mature, and it helps to ennoble you so you don't give in to your impulses. Once you see that something is going to be unskillful down the line, you have to learn how to suppress it if that desire is coming up in your mind. We don't like the word suppression. We tend to confuse it with repression. Repression is the unhealthy way to react to unskillful mental states. In other words, you pretend that they're not there. And because you pretend that they're not there, you're in huge denial. Large parts of your awareness get cut off. Those impulses are allowed to fester in their little hidden corner of their little locked-up room. But they don't stay locked up for long. That's why repression doesn't really work. Suppression is something different. It's the ability to say no to a desire as you know it's happening. You know it's there, but you simply learn how to say no. Now the approach here is not just say no. The Buddha gives you ways of thinking that help you say no. The two qualities that he says are treasures of the mind, the protectors of the world: a sense of shame and a sense of compunction. Shame is when you have enough self-respect to be able to tell yourself, I don't want to do that because it would be beneath me. This is where a strong sense of self is very helpful. A sense of self-respect is very helpful here. And it includes respect for your teachers and all the people who have helped you along. You'd be ashamed to have them know that you had done that particular thing, or you're ashamed of yourself that you've taken your good training and simply thrown it away. And so shame here is not a debilitating sense that you're a bad person and that you are ashamed of yourself. It's a sense that you're a really good person. You've received good training and yet you might be thinking about following a bad action, so you realize it's beneath you. It's not in keeping with what you know to be true. That sense of shame is very helpful in suppressing unskillful desires. Compunction is the ability to foresee a dangerous or to foresee an undesirable result of an action and say, I just don't want to go there. This quality is based on goodwill for yourself, realizing that the little bit of pleasure that comes from an unskillful impulse now is not really worth all the danger, all the sorrow and suffering that will come down the line. You care for yourself. This is where you show goodwill for yourself. This is why it's also possible to translate this quality as concern. In other words, you're not apathetic. You don't have a who cares attitude. You care because you realize that once you've done something unskillful, you can't buy it back. There is that line in the Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam. The moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. Nor all your eloquence nor wit can lure it back to erase half a line. Nor all your tears wipe out a word of it. In other words, the moving finger that writes the story of your life is you, your choices. You're the one who is writing the story. And if you've written a bad action in the story or a bad chapter in the story, you can't go back and erase it. So keep this in mind. That your actions do have consequences and you really do care about yourself. You don't want to destroy your happiness. If you can develop that sense of concern and compunction, together with a sense of shame, they really help you to say no to unskillful desires. When you're saying no to these things, you've got to find other things that you can say yes to. That's what the third principle is about. It's called sublimation. You take your desire for pleasure and channel it in skillful ways. This is why we have the practice of right concentration. That's the aspect of the Four Noble Truths where the Buddha talks very openly about pleasure, rapture, a sense of fullness in the body, allowed to spread and permeate throughout the body, the way the cool water of a spring can fill an entire lake. Or lotuses growing immersed in the lake or thoroughly saturated in the water of the lake. It's really intense pleasure, really intense sense of well-being. And when you can tap into that, it makes the ability to operate on heedfulness, a sense of shame, a sense of compunction, a lot easier. You're not just denying yourself. You're learning where to channel your desire for pleasure in a skillful way. The Buddha's realization that this was the path came after he had spent 6 years undergoing all sorts of self-inflicted tortures, afraid of pleasure of any kind. When he realized that that wasn't the path, he asked himself, what might be the path? And he remembered the time when he had been practicing jhana. He hadn't been intentionally practicing jhana, but had just sat under a tree when he was a child, and his mind naturally settled into the level of the first jhana, with a sense of rapture and ease. So he asked himself, could this be the path? And he had an instinctive answer. Yes. But that pleasure, he said, why am I afraid of that pleasure? After all, it's blameless, it's not harmful. It's not unskillful. So he made up his mind not to be afraid of it. That was the first factor of the path that he realized. If you're going to be doing concerted work on your mind, you have to be able to tap into a sense of well-being whenever you need it. Otherwise the work gets dry. As Ajahn Fuang once said, the meditation loses its lubricant. Like an engine that runs out of oil, it just seizes up. For the path to stay alive, for you to stay on the path, requires being able to tap into this sense of well-being. Simply sitting here breathing in, breathing out, it feels good all over the body. That's the skill of right concentration. That's where you sublimate your unskillful desires and you direct them here. There is a phrase someplace in the canon, I don't know exactly where the different levels of right concentration are called the sport of the noble ones. This is where they have their fun. They find their pleasure, they find their sense of well-being, they find their enjoyment here. So, remember, the process of getting the mind to settle down should be an enjoyable process. If you find that it's getting dry, learn how to think in ways that give it a little more moisture, a little more lubricant. The Buddha talks of a person working on the process of establishing mindfulness, either in the body in and of itself, feelings in and of themselves, mind in and of itself, mental qualities in and of themselves. You focus on these things and sometimes it gets dry, and he says, there's a fever in the body, or a fever appearing in the mind. Even though these are the themes of right concentration, you're not finding them very easeful or rapturous. So he says to focus on a topic that you do find inspiring. It might be the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha, qualities of generosity, goodwill, any of the Brahmaviharas, the practice of virtue. Contemplate these things until the mind feels inspired. Once it gets lubricated, you can settle down with the breath again. And you find that the mind is willing to settle down and be still. So the practice of concentration is designed specifically to give you that sense of pleasure whenever you need it, because the work of insight is sometimes very difficult. The mind is going to resist unless you learn how to put it in the right mood. All of these skills are the skills of a mature mind. The ability to anticipate danger, the ability to say no to unskillful desires, and the ability to channel your desires for pleasure in a harmless direction are all noble activities that bring dignity into our lives. Years back when I first came back to the States, I was giving a Dharma talk one night, and there was a Russian emigre in the group. And I had mentioned the topic of dignity in the talk. After the talk, she came up to me and she said, "You know, I've been in America all these years now. I learned the word dignity when I was studying English in Russia, but I've never heard the word dignity come out of an American's mouth until today. That's something to think about." This is why we so sorely need this path in our country, this ennobling path. That's why we so sorely need it ourselves, because it's the only way that we're going to find a happiness that's noble, harmless, blameless, a happiness that allows us to maintain our dignity and our nobility. So this is a very precious path. Learn to value it and allow it to do its work on you, so that whatever noble qualities you have can be brought, as the texts say, to the culmination of their development. The wisdom of tenacity. August 22, 2008. We come to the practice because we're looking for some wisdom in our lives. We've heard that by meditating, the mind gets to calm down. When it's calm and still, it can see things more clearly. But then the question arises, what kind of wisdom are we looking for? And it's important to understand right off the bat that wisdom is not a matter of being smart or stupid. Rather, it comes from conviction in the importance of your actions. It's as simple as that. Just learning how to apply that principle across the board turns conviction into wisdom. Normally we sometimes believe in the importance of our actions and sometimes don't. We dither around. Sometimes we don't like to think that our actions are going to yield results because we know that our actions have been unskillful. Then there are other times when we hope very sincerely that they will yield results because we went to the effort to do something good. And so we dither back and forth this way. As a result, wisdom doesn't arise. Einstein once noted that if you look at the history of science, a lot of major discoveries came from young scientists, but then the same scientists tended to peter out as they got older. As he understood it, it wasn't because they got more stupid as they got older. It was simply that, as a young scientist, you're not afraid to hang on to some line of questioning to see how far it goes. You have tenacity. Whereas older scientists see lots of potential lines of inquiry and can never really settle on one or the other. Part of the problem, of course, is their sense of their impending death. They're afraid that if they latch on to something wrong, then they will have wasted their later years. Of course, if they don't latch on to anything at all, they're sure to waste their later years. But the younger scientists aren't afraid to latch on to something just to see how far it goes. That's how the qualities of conviction and tenacity make all the difference. There's a story in the Pali tradition of two brothers, Mahapandaka and Kulapandaka. The canon doesn't tell much about them aside from the fact that they were brothers and eventually both became arahants. But in the commentary, you learn that Mahapandaka was very intelligent and Kulapandaka very dumb, so dumb that he embarrassed his older brother. Still, Kulapandaka eventually became an arahant. The stories vary as to how, but in each case it's a matter of Kulapandaka's finally settling down with one meditation topic and really carrying through with it. It was through his tenacity that he finally figured things out. So as you approach this question of how to give rise to wisdom in your life, you can compare the very basic wisdom teachings with the more refined ones, and you find that they're pretty much all of a piece. One of the Buddha's basic definitions of wisdom is knowing which tasks are really your business and which ones aren't, and then focusing on the ones that are your business and avoiding the ones that aren't. It sounds simple and basic, and it is. But if you really carry through with it, the implications can take you far. What are your tasks? Well, if you want to find true happiness, one of the tasks is to develop the path. That's what we're trying to do right here. To give rise to a state of concentration. The mind could be giving rise to all kinds of other states right now, but you've got to choose. These are the states that are really worth getting the mind into. They may seem fabricated and constructed, and sometimes you wonder how something constructed like this could be worthwhile. But the mind is used to constructing things, and as long as it has this habit, you might as well construct things that help take you further. That's part of the genius of the path. You could be sitting here creating all kinds of narratives in your mind, all kinds of theories about yourself and the world around you, but where do those theories lead? If you have the idea of yourself as a bundle of needs that have to be met, that are going to pull you away from the path, you have to learn how to question those needs. Are they really needs, or are they just ideas that you stitch together out of impulses? This is a lot of what addiction is about. You have an impulse here and an impulse there, and the mind starts stitching them together, saying, "Oh, there's a message here from my body that I really need X," even though it may be something really unskillful, really unhealthy. But it tends to take on a life of its own, so that every time the impulse arises, you say, "Oh, that's a sign that there's this big massive need." In cases like that, you want to undo the theory behind that interpretation, undo the narrative, learn how to cut it up into little bits and pieces. In other words, each time an impulse comes, see it just as an impulse and watch it in and of itself. This is where one of the more abstract wisdom teachings comes in. As the Buddha says, the strength of discernment is knowledge of arising and passing away, which we tend to equate with one of the more advanced stages of practice, but it doesn't have to be. You see an impulse arise, you see an impulse pass away, that's it. And whether there's a need lurking behind it or not, don't ask. Just watch it as an event in the present moment, and you can begin to deconstruct your belief in that massive need. You're following the task of abandoning the cause of suffering. In other words, your tendency to create enemies in your mind, ideas, urges, narratives, that really go against your own best interests. So to stitch those needs together is not your duty right now. It's not one of your tasks. Learn to deconstruct it, to let it go. As for what is your task, you learn to stitch together moments of concentration. To begin with, they may seem like momentary blips on the screen. The mind settles down for a bit, and, oops, there it's gone, off someplace else. It all seems so hopeless and inconsequential. But you want to learn how to appreciate those little blips of stillness. They're small and unassuming to begin with, like house elves, but without them the mind would go crazy. Many people come to meditation wondering, when is the mind going to settle down? I don't see any concentration at all. The problem is that it does settle down in little bits and pieces, but then we trash those little bits and pieces of concentration, those little bits and pieces of stillness. They don't seem impressive. They don't seem like anything we could rely on, so we throw them away. This is where conviction comes in. It's not a matter of being smart or dumb, simply a matter of holding on to the conviction that these are skillful mind states. And the task is set out. If you want to find a way to true happiness, you learn how to stitch these things together. So you focus on arising and passing away, but with a specific purpose. When those moments of stillness come, you want to understand why. What did you do? When they go away, you want to understand. What did you do? You're not just watching them arising and passing away, and leaving it at that, you also have an agenda. Once you begin to notice skillful patterns of mind, you want to stitch them together. What can you do to give rise to these moments of stillness again and again and again? What can you do to keep them going once they are there? Ajahn Lee once commented that there are 3 stages in the meditation. One is learning how to do it. The second is learning how to maintain it. And the third is learning how to put it to use. The doing is not all that hard. You focus on the breath, and there you are. The maintaining is what's hard. You go shooting past the breath off in the other direction to something else. Then you come shooting past it again. It's like a little kid running into the house, grabbing a sandwich, and running back out again, and then finding that he's dropped the sandwich as he's running along. What you need to do is learn how to get a sense of balance there when you're with that moment of stillness. And this will take time. In the beginning, you put a lot of energy into it. You wonder how on earth can you ever maintain it. But as the stillness grows, it begins to give energy back to you. It becomes a positive feedback loop in both senses of the term. In other words, the more you do it, the more energy you have. The more energy you have, the more you can do it. And it's a good positive thing. So when you're thinking about developing wisdom in your practice, don't overlook the basics. Simple things like the Buddha's comment that the difference between a wise person and a fool is that the wise person sees the need to train his or her mind. What makes a person foolish is not seeing that need. You've got lots of smart people out there in the world who don't see that need. Their training of the mind is simply teaching it how to think in different ways and to memorize different things. When the Buddha's talking about in training the mind, he's talking about developing good qualities like honesty, persistence, tenacity, conviction, which are not a matter of being smart or stupid, but simply a matter of wanting sincerely to find long-term happiness. That's another one of his basic definitions of wisdom. It begins with the question, what when I do it will lead to my long-term welfare and happiness? It's a wise question because you realize that long-term happiness is a lot better than the quick fix, and that it's going to depend on your actions. So the basic wisdom teachings are often the wisest. If you start getting off into advanced theory, it's very easy to get lost and not even know you're lost, because you think you know more than you do. In fact, one of the most basic wisdom teachings is this: knowing that your own foolishness is foolishness. The fool is the person who doesn't recognize his foolishness, who feels that only the subtle abstract teachings are good enough for him. If you remember that wisdom begins with your willingness to recognize your foolishness, that teaching will carry you far. Ajahn Lee once made a comment that we tend to confuse things. We think the teachings that seem basic and simple aren't deep. We think the deep teachings are the ones that are abstract and obscure. But a lot of times, those abstract and obscure teachings are just words. The fact you can say them doesn't mean anything at all. The deep teachings are the ones that give us advice that's useful all the time, right here, right now. Because what use is wisdom if it can't lead to long-term happiness, if it can't stop you from causing yourself to suffer? Ajahn Lee's uses the analogy of a person who wants to find gold. He knows there's gold in the rock in the mountain. The person who thinks he's smart tends to think, well, all I have to do is just go out there, take a little pick, and get the gold out. I don't want the rock, I want just the gold. I'd be stupid to take the rock. But you can't get the gold out of the rock with a pick. In other words, you can't gain the Dhamma by figuring things out too much in advance. The person who's going to succeed is the one who's convinced that there's gold here, but it may take time, and it may take work. But he's willing to put in the effort. He's willing to use his tenacity. You take the rock, you carry it home, and you throw it in the fire. Eventually the fire reaches the melting point of the gold, and the gold comes out on its own without your having to pry it loose from the rock. In other words, you hold to a few basic principles and apply them across the board, in particular, this principle of knowing what's your task and what's not. If you know what your task is, you just stick with it. As for all the other work you could be doing, you can let it go. You don't have to waste your time. So as you sit here stilling the mind, it's like taking the rock and subjecting it to heat. Just sit here and watch as precisely as you can what's going on. If there are unskillful mental states that threaten to stitch themselves together, you learn how to cut all the connections. As for the skillful ones, you learn how to sew them together. That much right there is going to solve a lot of the problems of the mind. Arising and passing away. August 25, 2008. The Pali word for clinging, upadana, has been taken into the Thai language and given an interesting meaning. The Thai word is upatan, and the meaning that they give is best illustrated by an example. You're sitting alone in a hut in the forest, and you hear sounds outside, maybe the sound of a person walking around your hut, a little sound here, a little sound there, and the mind stitches it together to the point where you're convinced that there's a ghost outside. That's upatan. You create a whole narrative, you create a whole other being out there, simply out of little bits and pieces of sounds. You can stitch it into something that's really scary, overwhelming. For a long time I didn't understand how that was related to the Pali word upadana, clinging. But if you stop and consider how we cling to our addictions, you begin to see the relationship. If you're addicted to a certain type of behavior, you create a whole narrative around your need for that behavior. You're a person who has that kind of need. But what do you create that sense of need out of? Little tiny sensations in the body, little thoughts that flit through the mind. Say that you've been addicted to cigarettes. There are certain symptoms in the body that you tend to try to treat with a cigarette. After a while, you begin to interpret those symptoms when they come as a sign of a need. You've created the need out of whole cloth. Not quite whole cloth, there are little sensations in the body, sensations in the back of your hands, and sensations in your chest. Whatever. But you take these little impulses and you make them more than they are. You also create a sense of yourself around that. You are the person with that addiction, you are the person with that need. This is a very direct way of illustrating the Buddhist principle that our sense of self can lead to suffering, because we create a sense of self that actually wants something unhealthy, even though it knows it's unhealthy. The way to work around that is through the discernment that cuts through your clinging. One of the Buddha's definitions for the strength or faculty of discernment, faculty here being a bad translation for the Pali word indriya. It means more like a dominant factor in your mind, something that's powerful and strong in your mind. One of the definitions for the strength or faculty of discernment is knowledge of things arising and passing away, or simply knowledge of arising and passing away without even the things, just the process of arising and passing away. It's usually interpreted as a very advanced stage of vipassana or insight. But you don't have to wait until you're in an advanced stage. You can simply look at what's going on. What are the sensations that trigger the whole storyline that says, oops, there's that need showing itself again? Can you look just at the sensations arising and passing away? Because part of that storyline is that when they arise and pass away, they're going to come back, and they're going to keep coming back until you finally give in to them, which is a very unskillful storyline. Yes, they will come back, but they'll go away. And they'll come again and they'll go away again. If you resist giving in to them, it's not the case that they're going to grow bigger and bigger each time they return. They'll simply go away again. Of course, it's helpful to have an alternative way of dealing with those sensations. That's why we practice concentration, to give the mind a ready access to a sense of well-being that it can tap into whenever it needs. And around that sense of well-being you will create a different sense of self. You're the competent person who can access this well-being. So you provide yourself with a different storyline, a different standing point for the mind. It's not a precarious place that's pushed around by the slightest little impulse. It can stand firm and begin to question those interpretations that you used to build around the little impulses, the storyline that says, since those impulses are going to come again, you might as well give in to them now, so they don't come back stronger. But even when you give in to them, they'll still come back again, and then you give in to them again, although it's hard to say that you give in to the sensation. The sensation just comes and goes. You give in to the storyline. You give your credence to the storyline that says, I need this. The sex drive is a great example of this. Certain symptoms arise in the body and the mind. You say, oops, there it goes. Got to give in. But those symptoms come and then they go. It's not that the body needs sex. It can survive perfectly well without it. The mind creates a story, a sense of self, A sense of what's out there in the world, a sense of what's inside in here, that would induce you to give in to the desire for sex. But the actual impulse, if you sit through it and learn how to breathe through it, and learn how to relax the body around it, is not that overwhelming. We talk often about this in terms of physical needs, but the body doesn't really have that many needs. It's perfectly content to die. We're the ones who want it to survive. We're the ones who want it to feed and do all the other functions we like. So you have to look into the mind to see how the mind stitches things together in this process of upatan, stitching little sensations together and making a bigger deal out of them than they have to be. This is one of the reasons why the Buddha has us focus on just arising and passing away, what's immediately apparent, immediately present to the mind, without going into the stories of whether there's something behind it out there, or something experiencing it, or some agent in here that's experiencing it and reacting to it. Just look at the sensations coming and going in and of themselves, and you begin to realize that they don't have the force you attributed to them. The only reason you attributed that force to them is because you wanted to use them as an excuse, but when you can begin to see that they lead you into unskillful behavior, you don't have to play along with those attributions anymore. So the Buddha gives you a two-pronged approach here. One is to get the mind into concentration. This is why strong concentration is so essential to the path. As the Buddha said, even though you may see the drawbacks of sensual desires, if you don't have the sense of pleasure that comes from jhana, you can't withstand them. You've got to have an alternative source of happiness, an alternative source of pleasure and ease. And at the same time, you need the right way of looking at things. When the Buddha set out dependent co-arising, he wasn't trying to impress people with what a complex idea he could cook up. Some of the most important features of dependent co-arising are right on the surface. And one of those features is just that. You look at things on the surface without trying to guess at what lies in the depths. You reduce these things to simply, there is passing away, arising again, passing away on the surface. You see that they are not nearly as powerful as you thought they were. They are not nearly as compelling as you thought they were. That puts you in a position of greater strength. When you learn to look at these things simply as stress arising and stress passing away, realizing that you have better ways of dealing with those simple sensations, it goes a long way toward overcoming whatever addictions you may have. The deep-seated drives you attribute to the mind are powerful because you think that they're deep-seated. When you learn to see them simply as constructs that you've placed on top of very superficial and ephemeral sensations, things that come and go very quickly, it may seem disorienting because your sense of who you are is often based around the so-called needs you've created. But when you've got an alternative way of functioning, an alternative way of seeing yourself, you're not so threatened by the idea of letting go of those old ways. So the combination of right concentration and right view can help you pass these issues. I remember talking to a scholar who was very concerned that Buddhism not be treated as a psychology. It was more serious than that, he said. It was a philosophy, it's a metaphysics. He didn't like the idea that it was just a therapy. And I countered it by saying that I don't like the idea that it's just a philosophy. Therapy is more important. Right view, right concentration. These are meant to be therapy for the ways the mind creates suffering for itself. Because addiction is a way it creates suffering, you want to be able to use these tools to get past your addictions. Your old ways of clinging, the stories you create about the being inside, and the situations outside that you stitch together out of sensations that when you really look at them are really not that powerful at all. When you learn how to let go of that habit of stitching things together, you find that your problems are not nearly as overwhelming as you thought they were. You can gain the upper hand. So keep this point in mind. The Thai way of interpreting upatan may not quite correspond with what's in the Pali Canon, but it does give a good insight into the process of how clinging works and how to take the clinging apart so you don't have to keep suffering from it. Turtle Meditation. August 27, 2008. One of the reasons concentration is so central to the path is that the mind can see things more clearly when it's still. Not only that, it can feel things more clearly as well. As you get more sensitive to the breath, you become more sensitive to the whole range of energy in your body. You can see where you're holding things in, where you're covering things up. You can also see the impact of your actions. When you're really sensitive inside, if you do something unskillful, say something harsh, or you harm somebody else, you feel it more intensely inside. That old saying that your parents often said when they were hitting you, that this hurts me more than it hurts you, and you didn't really believe them. It really does apply to meditators. Sometimes you say something a little bit harsh to someone else and they hardly notice it, but you feel it. It hurts. We were talking today about some of the basic principles in the path that allow you to be more compassionate, and this is one of them. The fact that, as the mind gets more and more still, you are more and more sensitive to the energies in your body. You sense the repercussions of your words, your deeds, and your thoughts. You see that even a thought, as it appears in the mind, will have an impact on the energy in the body. In fact, when it first appears, it's on the borderline between the two. When the mind is really still and fills the whole body, you sense little thoughts beginning to form, like little cysts or knots in your energy field. And when a thought first appears, it's hard to say whether it's physical or mental. It's both. Or it has both aspects. And if you're on the lookout for thoughts, if you're wanting thoughts, you can turn that little knot of energy or cyst of energy into a full-blown thought world. Once you get into that little world, you can travel around. Which is why we like these thought worlds. They seem to take us places. But they keep coming back to the same old place. And the thrill of the ride often disappears very quickly. If a thought was unskillful, if involved greed, anger, delusion, lust, jealousy, fear, or whatever, it will have an impact on the mind. The mind will quiver in a certain way that lets you know that this was unskillful. And the quivering doesn't last just for a few seconds. Sometimes it goes on for a whole day. If you let yourself get involved in unskillful thoughts, spinning out thought worlds of lust or anger, then when the time comes to sit and meditate, you find that the mind is still reverberating. So the stillness here is a good check on your actions. One of the basic principles is that following the precepts helps your concentration, and your concentration helps strengthen your discernment. But the influences go in the other way as well. The more discernment you bring to your concentration, the stronger it's going to be. The more concentration and discernment you bring to your precepts, the less harmful your actions are going to be. Because the restraint you exercise becomes something that's not just a matter of the precepts. Anything that's unskillful, any intention that would have a harmful effect, you notice. You feel it. And it doesn't feel right. Ajahn Suwat often commented on how when you get the mind concentrated, it becomes both tough and tender. Tough in the sense that it can withstand all kinds of unpleasant sensory contact. When the body is in pain but the mind is strong, you can be with the pain and not suffer from it. When people are being harsh with you, you can develop an energy field around the body by staying with the breath, letting the breath fill the whole body, so that their energy can't penetrate your energy field. When you fully occupy your body in this way, their negative energy goes right past you. You don't suck it in. You don't absorb it. So in that sense, the concentrated mind is tough. But it's tender in the sense that it becomes very sensitive. And particularly, you become sensitive to your own actions, so that your virtue is not simply a matter of the precepts. It becomes a deeper quality of the mind, so that even though the things you do may not be against the precepts, but if they're harmful, you know. And that knowing helps refine your restraint. This is a point Ajahn Lee made in his book The Craft of the Heart. And I think he picked it up from Ajahn Mun, because a lot of the Dharma in The Craft of the Heart comes from Ajahn Mun. The precepts help concentration and discernment. Concentration helps your precepts and your discernment, and your discernment helps your concentration and your precepts. These three aspects of the path help one another along. This combination of tenderness and toughness. A good image for a meditator is a turtle. The turtle's body is one of the most sensitive bodies in the whole lizard kingdom. So it needs that shell for its protection. In the same way, You want the toughness of concentration to protect you from being weak in the face of adverse conditions, so you don't pick up negative energies, so you don't get knocked off course by unpleasant sights, or sounds, or smells, or tastes or tactile sensations or ideas. That's the toughness you want. As for the tenderness, it's a tenderness inside, where you're sensitive to the slightest thought, the slightest word, the slightest action. It's possible to meditate and get concentrated and not have this kind of sensitivity, because your concentration isn't imbued with discernment. There are people who can get their minds thoroughly concentrated and still be very harmful to others, because their concentration is one-sided, narrow, loaded with denial. But when your concentration is the sort that fills the whole body, and it's imbued with discernment, this is the kind of concentration you're developing here. As you work with the breath, the more sensitive you get to the slightest variations in the breath, the more sensitive you are to the least little bit of stress that you're causing yourself. The more you're imbuing your concentration with discernment. Then as you spread the breath to fill the whole body, or spread that sense of ease to fill the whole body, the range of your concentration is such that your gaze becomes all around. The text talks of the Buddha as an all-around eye. And what they mean is that his whole body was sensitive. The range of his gaze was 360 degrees. That's the kind of quality you want to develop in your concentration, so that it becomes a basis for skillful action in every aspect of life, both inside and out. As you meditate, you're exercising the 4 Brahmaviharas. Goodwill, in terms of the concentration practice or focusing on the breath, means that you want the breath to be as comfortable as possible. Compassion here means that when you find that it's uncomfortable, you do what you can to make it more comfortable, make it more pleasant. If it's already pleasant, then you exercise empathetic joy, appreciating the fact that you can do it. You hear of some meditators who feel that they don't deserve the pleasure that comes from meditation. They feel uncomfortable feeling happy. If you find that you have that problem, recognize it as a problem. You're not being realistic, you're being one-sided. Learn how to appreciate the fact that yes, you can get the breath to be comfortable, and the body can be filled with a sense of ease and well-being, and that there's no issue of deserving or not deserving this pleasure. It's something that you can learn how to use skillfully, both for your own sake and for that of others, so don't shy away from it. Then there are areas where you can't make the breath comfortable no matter what. That's when you exercise equanimity. If there are parts of the body that are painful and the breath can't do anything for the pain, you learn how to exercise equanimity there. This way you're getting practice in the Brahmaviharas, learning how to develop a goodwill, compassion, empathetic joy and equanimity that are universal, limitless. Then you learn how to apply these different emotions as appropriate. So as you get more sensitive inside, it puts you in a better position to be more sensitive to what you're doing outside, more sensitive to what the appropriate approaches might be. In this way the practice of meditation is not selfish. The idea that it's selfish is based on the idea that your well-being has to conflict with the well-being of others, that you have to choose one or the other. The Buddha's insight was that if you look for genuine well-being, you find that it doesn't conflict with anybody else's well-being. It actually fosters theirs. One common image is of candles. Each person is holding a candle. You have a lit candle. The fact that yours is lit means that you can help light other people's candles. Your flame is not diminished. And over time, as more candles get lit, they bring more and more brightness for everyone. As today's session concludes, we extend an invitation for ongoing engagement. Just as Buddha encouraged spreading his teachings, we urge your involvement. Help disseminate these profound teachings universally by subscribing, liking, and sharing. Your active participation ensures these invaluable insights resonate widely. Embrace this chance to spark positive change and nurture understanding. We eagerly await your continued presence in future episodes, joining hands to illuminate minds and foster compassion globally.